Welcome to the Nonprofits. Our fourth and final segment this week is about our old friend, evolution. Kelley, you're our resident scientist. Why don't you give us the lowdown here?
Sure, I'd love to, Scott. Scientists in Sweden have been discovering some really interesting data as part of a decades-long study on snails. Yes, snails, those often overlooked animals populating our shorelines, lakes, and ponds across the world. In a long-term study, they've been able to observe a species of snail common to the coast of Sweden actually change phenotypes within a few generations and even follow predicted paths. Prediction, of course, being a very important part of the scientific method. While this might seem like a victory for Lamarckian ideology, with them just changing in a couple generations, I want to make sure our viewers understand the science behind this and things like horizontal gene transfers, a relatively new idea among genetic biologists, while not downplaying how important a discovery this is in the meantime. Now, this isn't an amazingly new discovery. We have discovered things like this before, but it does fortify our ideas about how genetic changes can occur without sexual activity and gives us way more understanding into the science of genetics. This story is from Popular Mechanics and was written by Daniel Orff on October 11, 2024.
All right. Excellent. Kelley, thank you very much. Now, you mentioned Lamarck, and he's known for promoting the now passe idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics.
Yes.
How a parent can develop some characteristic, and then that would get passed on to the children after that. So
right.
how is Darwin's...
I like to use the example of if the dad lifts weights a lot and becomes real strong, his children will be stronger.
Exactly. So how's Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection? How is that different from Lamarck? And why does this information support Darwin specifically and not Lamarck?
First off, I want to make sure it was Russell who came up with natural selection. It was Darwin who came up with evolution off of Russell's natural selection.
Okay.
So I just want to make that clear before we go any farther.
Because we got to give props. We got to give props where they're deserved. Yep.
Russell he's like the black sheep of the evolutionists, and nobody remembers who he was. But it differs in that natural selection doesn't happen in one generation. It's something that takes occurrence over quite amount of time. And it's done because the organism is trying to adapt better to its environment, which in Lamarck, you could actually create these things that you would pass on to your children, which of course we know is not true anymore. So I hope that kind of cleared up the idea between natural selection and Lamarckian ideology. Now, people are still keeping Lamarckian ideology alive, and it's had its ups and downs. In the Soviet Union, it got real popular under Trofim Lysenko, and he actually became Minister of Agriculture in the Soviet Union under Stalin, mostly because he was a yes man, but he was using Lamarckian ideas, and it led to a lot of problems with the agricultural programs there.
So how do the specific findings of these scientists support Darwin over Lamarck? I mean, because we're assuming that there's massive amounts of scientific evidence supporting evolution in general. Another mass of scientific research specifically supporting the idea of evolution by natural selection. What does this contribute to that? I was going to say conflict, but it's not really. I mean, there's definitely strong scientific consensus in one direction, but as you mentioned, there's still people kind of pushing Lamarck's thoughts here. So what's stopping the Lamarckians from jumping on this as saying, see, we told you the whole time?
The way I like to explain this is like as the red-haired child, right? You can have a recessive gene that is still there that will later become useful. And what was happening here, there was one species of snail with two different phenotypes, one that lived off on rocks off the coast and one that lived on the shoreline. They were the same species, but they had different characteristics. Now, they took some of the shoreline snails, dropped them off on some of the rocks, and within 30 years, they became the rock snails. And what had happened was that gene was already there. It was recessive. It was not being used, and they just picked it right back up and became just like the ones that had been living there before them.
So they were kind of just keeping it in their hip pocket for the time being, right?
Yeah, that's a great way to explain it. Sure.
Interesting. Okay, let's jump to Damien here. So Kelley was contrasting Lamarck and Darwin here, but how does this discovery shed light on the split between evolution in general and creationism?
Very good question. Well, look, creationists are going to creation, if that was a really really bad sentence. But as Kent Hovind would say, I can't believe I'm quoting Kent Hovind here, but Kent Hovind would say, "But they're still snails." It's like if we're trying to use this article to prove that evolution is true, I really don't think this is going to be it. It's a really interesting article, and look, I'm personally fascinated by how how organisms adapt to their environment. And I think my favorite example of this is the naked mole rat, which is this little African rat that lives in the desert underground, and it's virtually blind and it has like 2 teeth and all that. But the way that this particular rat has adapted to the desert environments, fantastic. But I do want to take point with the article. There was one sentence that they said that kind of made me go, huh. And it says, once the snails found themselves in that familiar environment, they accessed that genetic information, which in turn fueled rapid evolution. I would like to know how snails access genetic information. Like, do they have labs and DNA sequences and all that kind of stuff, or what? It's like
that is a really interesting choice of words, isn't it?
Can you prove that they don't have highly sophisticated labs? I mean, it's 50-50 until we know, right?
Because especially in previous years, I used to get into quite heated discussions with creationists, and one of the things that they would say is, biology makes extraordinary claims that sound ridiculous. And to be fair, in this instance, I have to agree. Snails have no way of accessing their own genetic information.
Right.
I agree that genes change, but I don't think they did it to themselves.
Yeah, right.
Stephen, I'd like to step over to you for a second. I know you've been itching to chime in on this subject here. In the movie Jurassic Park, the character Ian Malcolm, who's famously played by Jeff Goldblum, he says the famous quote, "Life finds a way," right? So what kind of light do these results cast on ideas like Dr. Malcolm's?
I wish that I wish I had more hope for the future. I'm sorry, I don't. I think all the billionaires are getting as much money, and they're going to hop onto Elon's rockets, and they're just going to head into space and leave us peons down here until the world is used up or is destroyed. And in that scenario, in that darkest scenario, it is encouraging for me to think that life does find a way. That we are not as great as humans think they are. It is encouraging for me to just be reminded of how small we are in the overall life narrative. That even snails are doing this really amazing thing where they're evolving back and forth.
Apparently, they're operating high-tech labs in Sweden there, right?
Probably, yeah, in Sweden of all places. Those socialist countries are funding everything, even the snail labs.
That's going to wind up in some conservative political ad, I think. Atheists claiming that the Swedish scientists are actually snails.
They're actually the snails? Okay, that's snails in disguise.
But I think it's encouraging.
Finish up, Stephen.
Yeah. I just think it's encouraging. It helps me appreciate my place within the greater tree of life. To remember that life will find a way, and even if we mess up this planet so badly that our way of living becomes a thing of ancient history, that life is going to find a way even without us.
Now, Kelly, you put in the notes, think of the gene that causes red hair. I would love to get your thoughts on that.
Well, that's what I was talking about. We have this gene that's a recessive gene. It's not good for it. We're not using it, right? It just pops up every once in a while. And that was kind of like the gene that was accessed by the snails, right?
In the high-tech lab in Sweden. Yes. So got it. That's
we're going downhill fast. So we got to hurry up and finish up this segment here.
So when are we going to see see the red-headed snails from Sweden.
That's what I was wondering next. I did mention earlier there in the introduction that this wasn't like the first kind of study we've done like this. There were several studies with Italian wall lizards and island populations of wall lizards, and those were kind of interesting too. And we found out these lizards would do the same thing. They would change phenotypes just within a few generations to better adapt to the new environment that they were put into, like being brought to a different island with different.
So, Kelley, what is a phenotype? Like, explain the phenotype and genotype, because when someone discusses evolution, they will use these words, but even to someone who is scientifically literate like me, you say phenotype, I go, okay.
Dog is a species. Labrador is a phenotype. Poodle is a phenotype.
So like a subspecies.
No, because they're the same species.
Well, I think
so
phenotype is like they're just
a variation of
something,
that.
Right?
They're just a variation of the species, but they're still within the species, right?
So contrast that with genotype then.
So what is a genotype?
That would be a subspecies. You would be an actual genetic difference.
So, okay, so we're talking about
we're talking about. I think and now I'm not a biologist. You got to remember, I'm a geologist. I would deal with dead things, but but I think what we're talking about here is the amount of difference. If you have, and I'm thinking this because we do this with minerals too. If we have just too much manganese instead of iron, it becomes a different mineral, right? But you can still have just enough iron in it, and it doesn't change being a mineral into a new mineral. So I'm assuming, not knowing biology that well, that's what we're looking at here. But the difference between a phenotype and a genotype, it's a certain amount of percentage difference.
Right. I always, and I might be wrong here too. Not two. I'm saying, Kelly's wrong. I might be wrong too.
Oh, hey, I could be totally wrong. Like I said, I deal with rocks.
I always learned about it as like genotype correlates to a cause, and phenotype correlates to an effect. Right. If the phenotype is the outwardly observed differences, we see like Kelley was saying, differences in dog breeds and things like that, and then the genotype is differences in the foundational, the genes. Right. It's the difference at the DNA level. So I don't know. I suppose that could be a way to look at it as well. But Kelley, you were talking about the genotypes and the genes, and genes lying in wait, I think was the phrase that the article used. I talked about having it in the hip pocket, that kind of thing. Yeah. How does that affect our understanding of adaptation and the potential for adaptability of other species? If this species can adapt rapidly due to these genes lying in wait that may have been developed in the past and then set aside and unused, or there could be any number of reasons how these could have gotten developed. But what does that tell us about assumptions that we might make of other situations about the adaptability of other species? Well,
I don't know that we can say that about all species can do this, can access that. I am just loving that. Can access that information in their little animal labs. Mm-hmm. So I know, like we've done studies with the wall lizard, the Italian wall lizard. We know they can do it. We've done studies with these snails. We know they can do it. But it's hard to do this kind of a study because you need to isolate the population to make the change happen. And you need to isolate it into a position, in an environmental position, where it has that gene to be used to adapt to that situation. It has to have that gene in its back pocket for that environmental situation, if you will.
So in some ways, it's a matter of coincidence, or is that what you're...
No, it's not really a coincidence because that gene was already there. In this case with the snail, there were two populations, right? So they just, and at one time they were probably one population, but the ones on the shoreline stopped needing the characteristics that the ones living out on the rocks off the shoreline needed. So they kind of, like you said, stuffed it in the back pocket and stopped using it. But now we're going to take them out we're going to isolate them out on one of these skerries, these rocks. And they go, hey, great grandpa knew how to do this, and boom, they bring it right back up. So that was almost as silly as accessing it, wasn't it? Great grandpa knew how to do this.
Hey, The gloves are off tonight, right? The gloves are off. We're just hitting it. We're telling it like it is. That's the deal
Science,
here.
baby.
You're seeing it here, right here on the nonprofits. I want to go back to Damien real quick here. So what does this tell us about? Because this was something that they discovered in the wild, and we hear critiques of evolution talking about you've never observed this kind of thing, and even if this type of thing is observed in the laboratory, it's set aside as well. You were intelligently manipulating the scenario. So what does the impact of finding a situation like this, where we do see these drastic changes over a relatively short period of time, in the wild, though? What's the significance of that, of the fact that this was in the wild versus the laboratory?
I think absolutely nothing. To someone who is absolutely convinced that life as we know it was created by an intelligent agent, more or less in its current form, you could just dismiss all of this as variations. And this is something that Kent Hovind will probably, like Kent Hovind we hear, he will probably say this is all just variations on a kind. They're still snails. They're still, and this is what I think I mentioned this before, is that, that we're not, creationists are looking for that like Pokemon type change where, now I don't know my Pokemon very well, but someone give me a Pokemon that changes quickly.
Pikachu. There, does that one change?
What is
I don't know
Pikachu?
anything, I don't know anything about
Pikachu.
Pokemon. What?
Sorry, Stephen?
Pokemon.
Let's just say Pokemon, right?
Okay, so I'm trying to give an example of a Pokemon, but yeah, like creationists are looking for that Pokemon that goes from one form to another within one generation. So we can prove via numerous different means how genes change, how genes affect body plans. We can see the fossil record that goes all the way back, or also all the way down, in geology, all that kind of stuff. But you're never going to convince someone who doesn't want to be convinced.
Right,
But I think from a rational,
so as a practical matter, it doesn't make a difference, is what you're saying.
No, I don't think so. This will be one more data point that they could ignore, because then the battleground will go from, well, how do they get the genetic information in the first place, to you can't explain consciousness. How does a person made up of material matter have a brain to be able to understand this in the first place? It must be because of a god.
Damien's turning into a pre-sup over here, I think. Is that what's happening? We're watching it. We're seeing it in real time here.
Evolution in action.
It's not scientific by saying, and I think Damien brought it up earlier, but it didn't change kind. It's still a snail, so it didn't change kind. And kind doesn't mean shit in science, right? It's just it's a word. So when you're trying to talk to people and about stuff like this, they don't even understand the language that's supposed to be used, and it's really difficult to get these ideas across. And I want to point out that we have watched a new species evolve that happened in the Galapagos Islands in the 1980s. It's called the big bird finch. It's a species of finch that came off of one of the native finches and a ground finch that was accidentally blown there during a storm. And there is now an established colony of these animals. It was a whole new species that was born, and we were able to watch it happen. So we have actually seen in real time evolution happening and creating a new species. And I have talked to creationists about that, and but it didn't change kind.
And this proves my point, Kelly, is that to someone who is adamant that a deity was involved, or even people who believe that evolution is essentially eugenics, or that, that evolution was why Hitler did all the things he did, you can point to a group of snails in Sweden that access their genetic information, and you'll not convince the creationist that evolution happens. Anything more than minor variations.
Yeah. I do want to point out one thing really quick here. And our director apparently knows much more about Pokemon than we do, because he's been cranking out names of Pokemons in the in the show chat here. So I just want to get that on the record there. But I want to go back to Stephen. So this kind of implies that there is at least the potential for some species to adapt and evolve rapidly if things go back to a previous state where they might have seen before, they've had an opportunity to evolve in that. Does that have any impact on our human perception of conservation of the environment? We talk about how the environment is changing, global climate change, and it's affecting our ecosystem negatively in such a way that it's making it more and more difficult for us to survive. Does this give us hope that maybe we can overcome something like that? Or what are your thoughts on that? I mean, does it have an impact on our views on conservation?
Like it gives me a warm, fuzzy feelings to consider the fact that even if we mess up the planet so severely that we can't live here, that other species will be able to pull into genetic material that maybe will help them at least survive. That makes me feel happier that other species will be able to survive our colossal fuck ups, even if we can't. Just the idea that other creatures that share this planet can be more adaptable and can adapt quickly. I think that'll be a tremendous advantage, and I welcome our soon snail overlords as they
our redheaded Swedish snail laboratory. They got the white coats on and everything, and apparently an iron fist as well. They've evolved that iron fist, and they lead with ruthlessness, right? I hope they don't revive their old snail religions, though. As long as they leave that out, I'm on board.
It's been nice knowing you guys. I've loved you since I met you. It's time to...
Boy, we've sure gotten to that place, haven't we? All right. Well, maybe I think this would be a good place to stop here. We've split off on as many tangents as we possibly can with this subject. But if you want to hear even more tangents from the nonprofits, click right here.